Good afternoon. I am Hannah Elko Meyers, Director of the Manhattan Institute's Initiative on Policing and Public Safety. New York City is gearing up for mayoral primaries in June and the election in November. The Big Apple's next leader, besides having to help the city's businesses, schools, and institutions recover from the pandemic, will be taking office amid a dramatic rise in violent crime and disorder that is only gaining momentum. According to the most recent NYPD stats, shooting incidents are up over 56% year to date. And that number is higher in vulnerable neighborhoods like Brownsville, Brooklyn, where shooting victims are up 133% since this time in 2020. There's also a growing sense of danger, spurred on by elements like the 26 subway pushings in 2020, and also the very troubling increase in hate crimes, often perpetrated by violent offenders who are released back onto the street without prosecution. Civil unrest over the past year, as we're seeing very vividly this week during the trial of Derek Chauvin, has led to rioting, curfews, and destruction of property and businesses. This surge in violence is happening in cities nationwide, and many will look to New York as a bellwether for the trajectory of public safety in urban America. So what should the next mayor do? And how much power does a mayor even have to affect public safety changes? The Manhattan Institute's New York City Reborn project has recently released a mayoral playbook with recommendations for the next administration across policy areas. Today, MI senior scholar Rafael Mangual, who is also our Deputy Director of Legal Policy and a contributing editor to City Journal, we'll be talking about the 4 priorities that he and I identified for security and public safety. We are incredibly honored to feature in this discussion the former New York City Police Department Commissioner Raymond Kelly to respond to these priorities and share his insights on the role and imperatives for the next mayor. And before I continue, I'd like to invite the audience to please, as you come up with questions, just drop them into the chat box on whatever platform you're using, and we'll try to get to all of them. Most viewers are familiar with Commissioner Kelly's background, so by way of a bio, I will add a few details of particular interest to this conversation. Ray Kelly held 25 different command positions at NYPD before serving as the department's 37th and later its 41st commissioner. He was first appointed by Mayor David Dinkins from 1992 until 1994, and later by Mayor Michael Bloomberg from 2002 until 2013. Under both administrations, he focused on community policing, on improved police relations and recruitments among minority New Yorkers, and quality of life issues. Pertinently, Commissioner Kelly brought the murder rate down in the city, setting the number of murders on a steep downward trajectory from its peak in 1990 at 2,262 that year. In his second tour, when cynics believed that murders could not go much below 600 a year, he reduced violent crime an additional 42% above that. No one has a better understanding of the role of the mayor in setting public safety priorities and how he or she can best realize those goals in partnership with citizens and the police. We are delighted to have you with us, Commissioner.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for those kind words.
Well, I'd like to begin by asking you, what do you believe the most pressing policing and public safety issues will be for New York City's next mayor?
Are you asking me?
Yes, please.
Well, obviously, there's still going to be a lot of work to be done as far as the impact of the pandemic is concerned. Businesses have got to come back. In Midtown, in particular, just was in Midtown yesterday, and it's still pretty empty, unfortunately. But as far as crime is concerned, there is a growing awareness and a growing concern on the part of people that New York is now going back to the bad old days, being crime-ridden. People are not willing to ride the subway. We just saw a recent survey that indicated that, largely because of their concerns about their own personal safety. So I think that the sort of the threshold requirement for the new mayor is to address the problem of crime and the perception of crime head on. I think the new mayor has to say quite directly that there is a crisis as far as crime is concerned, and we all have to come together to try to address it. Some of the things I would do, practical things that I think the mayor should do, would be to restore the anti-crime units to the streets of our city. These are police officers who are dressed in civilian clothes, who may be in taxi cabs, who may be in trucks, commercial trucks, that sort of thing. And for decades, they have been a very effective tool in fighting violent crime. I think this would be important both substantively and symbolically, because I think when these units were eliminated last year, that it was assigned to the police officers in the department, that the department was no longer really in the business of making arrests. So I think the anti-crime unit being reactivated is an essential ingredient in starting to come back and starting to reduce violent crime. Mayor de Blasio defunded the police department along with the city council. I think that the mayor has to commit immediately to refunding the police, if you will, to restoring those classes that were reduced. The department has experienced a huge brain drain, an experience drain, as a result of accelerated retirements, the reaction to the disorders of 2020. And I think another thing that has to happen is the mayor should take on the city council. The city council, I think, has become almost unhinged. They're committed to reducing the footprint of the police department. I would say that that's contrary to what most people in the city want. They have put in regulations and restrictions on the police that just beg that they don't do anything, and that's what's happening. They eliminated qualified immunity as a defense in civil court in New York City. Now, the city still contractually has to indemnify the police and has to represent them, but they make a determination as to whether or not a police officer was operating in the scope of his or her employment. They put in a diaphragm law, which makes it virtually impossible to arrest somebody who doesn't want to be arrested. Everybody has cameras out on the street. The public does. The police do as well. There's a whole series of other strange things that they've foisted on the police and police officers. This results in the cops just stepping back and not doing anything close to proactive measures that I think have, or at least made the city the safest big city in America. I don't think you can any longer claim that title. So those are some of the things that I think the next mayor should do as soon as he or she takes office.
Thank you so much. And before I turn it over to Ralph, a follow-up question: How much, what traits and what decisions that a mayor can make are the most effective in having those changes that you're looking for? Is it charismatic leadership? Is it who they appoint to top policing roles? Is it how well they manage interest groups? What's the secret?
Well, I think it's a little bit of all of those things. Yeah, the chief law enforcement officer in a city, any city, is the mayor. He sets the tone, or he or she sets the tone. He or she sets the policy. It is clearly happening in New York City now. The police commissioner reports directly to the mayor. The policies that we see carried out on the streets or not carried out are coming mostly from City Hall. So whether you like it or not, the mayor calls an awful lot of the shots that happen in the police department. So yeah, I was very fortunate. I had I worked for both Mayor Jenkins and Mayor Bloomberg. I think had good relationships with both. I'd like to think that they thought what I was doing was right thing to do, and that I like to think they believed I knew what I was doing. So we had a very good relationship. I don't think micromanaging from City Hall is a good thing, and I think, quite frankly, we're seeing some of that right now.
Thank you. Ralph, the commissioner touched on the problem of diminished ranks in the PD. Can you talk about what that looks like right now in New York and elsewhere in the country?
Yeah. So, the problem of police recruitment and retention is something that departments across the country have been dealing with for quite some time, and it's not just a recent phenomenon. In 2019, the Police Executive Research Forum in September of that year released a report showing that just 12% of responding departments said that they had not experienced trouble with recruitment and retention over the last 5 years, and 41% of department respondents said that those troubles had gotten worse over the previous 5 years. 2020 only exacerbated that, and I think part of that phenomenon is a function of the kind of just uptick in anti-police rhetoric that we've seen around the country. And I think it has the effect of causing police who are still on the job to step back, but I also think it's dissuading people from pursuing that career and dissuading people from staying in that career. I mean, Commissioner Kelly mentioned the concept of brain drain, which is really, really important, because I think it's very easy to sort of focus on some of the research that shows, and we note this in our report, that an increase in police presence is very clearly associated with decreases in crime, right? We know that more cops equals less crime. We know that adding patrols reduces crime. We know that adding officers reduces crime, whether that's because the officers can respond more quickly to scenes of serious crimes and increase clearance rates by that route, or whether because they function as deterrents just simply by their presence in the street. And so we sort of think of the size of a police force as somewhat of a blunt instrument, but the brain drain concept is really important here, because what we're seeing is that I think we have to rewind a little bit to the mid-90s, right? In 1994, the crime bill gave a lot of funding to municipalities to boost their police ranks. It was 100,000 police officers that were aimed to be hired across the country. It's been a while since then. So you have these officers who have built up experience that is relevant to the moment that we're in now, because they built that experience during a time in which crime was still very elevated across the country. And they're now reaching the age of retirement and choosing to take that route rather than stay on the job. And so I think the problem here with police recruitment and retention is twofold, insofar as we've just seen a broad reduction in numbers, but we've also seen a reduction in numbers that's driven by a reduction in the most experienced types of folks. So we're talking about detectives who have whose investigatory experience is just invaluable. And we're seeing that police departments around the country, including here in New York, are struggling with clearance rates. And I don't think that's going to get better until we start to replenish those ranks and encourage at least some of the more experienced officers to stick around a while longer. So, I do think it's going to be incumbent upon the next mayor to refund the department so that they can start to replenish their ranks. I mean, a lot of people will push back on the idea that the defunding of the NYPD was significant, right? We'll say that the top line budget cut was, I think, $1 billion. People will push back and say, well, effectively it was a lot less than that. But one thing we do know for sure is that the police department canceled an entire academy class, which I think was supposed to have 1,200 officers in it, and the effects of that are going to be lasting. So I think if New York is going to get crime back under control, it's going to need to close that gap and to pursue officers and officer recruits that are the likeliest to advance through the ranks quickly without losing effectiveness, right? I mean, when you're losing older officers, you're losing a lot of people who've made the rank of detective. We're going to need to fill those ranks with people who are sort of constituted for that job. And I think the city needs to make a really concerted effort to identify who those people are and attract them to this profession. That's going to cost money. You can't do that at the same time that you defund the department.
Thank you. And I would add, in my own experience working at an NYPD Intel, it was the most, seasoned investigators, people with relationships people with the experience on the job to have good judgment on topics that are very sensitive and where civil rights are involved, and where you want people that are really qualified and have a lot of experience. One last thing on this topic, Commissioner, when you took office as commissioner again in 2002, it was following a major budget cut the previous year, where you were suddenly down 6,000 police officers. Can you talk for just a moment about how you bounced back from that and what the impact was?
Well, it wasn't the previous year. It was that year. It was actually the end of 2002, 2003. Mayor Bloomberg decided to take money from the police department and move it to the Department of Education. It was one of the few times that we had disagreements. Most of my disagreement was with Mark Shore, who was handling the budget in those days. But that was a major blow. It reduced the department by 15%. But I think, Rafael, we are in a recruiting crisis throughout the country. This is a big, big deal. Why do you think these cops are retiring at these extraordinarily high rates? By the way, they're not retiring now at those rates because they have scheduled retirements. It used to be you could walk down and retire in 30 days, that sort of thing. You can't do that anymore. You're doing it remotely. But it doesn't mean that the demand to leave by those who can leave is not high. So the notion that you could recruit people who are educated and are motivated to be in policing, I think is just contrary to the facts that we see. The city council is all focused on restricting the police. The Policing in the 21st Century, which is a plan that emanated, or recommendations emanated from a commission that President Obama put in 2014, 59 recommendations. They're virtually all about restricting the police. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is all about restricting the police. So the question is who, somebody who is reasonably sharp individual, well educated, who is going to seek a career in policing? There's a lot of other things that they can do. We had an attempt. I don't want to drag this out, but I was in the first class of police cadets, which is in the 60s. It was an effort to get matriculating college students into policing. I thought it was a great idea. When I became a police officer, I went into the Marine Corps. So when I came back, that program had already been ended. Ben Ward, the police commissioner, asked me in the 80s, I was an inspector at the time, to reinstitute the police cadet program. And we did that. Our focus was on top educational institutions, NYU, Fordham, schools like that. And then I left government. That program was changed into basically a minority recruiting program that was looking at community colleges. So my point is, there's been a lot of efforts to get better educated people into policing, something I totally support. I like to see every police officer required to have a 4-year baccalaureate degree. When I tried to give additional money, special assignment money to police officers, this is in my second run as commissioner, I was about, I think it was a universe of 400 police officers that we could fund. And the precinct COs and their supervisors would make those recommendations. I was fought by the union. You cannot single out individual people and give them more money than other cops. The only exceptions are, of course, the detectives, which was in existence, and a small number of special assignment police officers. And they won. They won the case. So your proposal would be very strenuously objected to by the unions. And the only way I think you'd be able to do that is through state legislation.
No, it's such a great point, a series of points that you raised, and I'm so glad that you did, because I think it paints a picture for the incoming administration of just how much work needs to be done to attract the kind of people that are going to produce the results that they all want, right? We're in a moment where there is a very critical eye focused on police departments, not just in the city, but around the country, as you noted, when at the same time, efforts that would be calculated to produce better results and minimize the kind of mistakes and bad outcomes that drive a lot of the protests that are behind a lot of this, a lot of the critiques, are just being furiously fought, not just by the sort of, advocates that we would expect, to oppose efforts to reinforce policing, but also, as you pointed out, at least in the past, by some of the unions. And, I do think it's just imperative for the incoming administration to understand exactly what the dynamics are, understand what's at stake, and communicate to the city council that the only way that they are going to have a shot at attracting the sort of people that we know can do the job, and to do it well, and to do it under the sort of circumstances that people are asking them to, that's going to require drastically shifting the sort of risk calculus that's currently involved for people who are making this decision, right? If you're talking about highly educated, psychologically stable potential recruits, these are also going to be people who have multiple career options that they can choose from. And I think you raise a really good question, which is why on earth, given the zeitgeist, would anyone choose a career in policing where you're going to start off making $59,000 a year, in a time of rising crime, in a time in which, protesters are spitting at you and calling you names and tossing bottles? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I do think that there needs to be a really drastic effort to counteract the fact that over the last few years, the people in leadership have essentially raised the transaction costs of becoming a cop, while at the same time lowering the transaction costs of being a criminal, right? I think this is the sort of dynamic that has probably contributed a significant degree to the situation we're in with respect to the violent crime uptick.
I just hope that the standards are not lowered, because I think that there's a real risk there, to bring in folks who shouldn't be in policing for political reasons. Hey, I don't want to say I can't hire people, so let's do something with the standards, the background investigation, that sort of thing. So that's another issue that has to be that we have to be aware of.
Commissioner, you mentioned the significance of state level actions in these decisions. This past summer, New York Governor Cuomo issued Executive Order 203, which mandated that every jurisdiction come up with a plan to reform and reinvent policing. How effective can the next mayor be in that atmosphere, and how much control does a mayor have in policy, as opposed to the effect of the governor, the president, New York City's 5 district attorneys and 2 U.S. attorneys? What's the power?
Well, look, there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of complexity to it. But I mean, you bring up an interesting point. Look at the district attorneys in New York now. Essentially, Rafael, you talked about quality of life issues, and through community policing, we could address that maybe more effectively. But the district attorneys are not prosecuting these cases on their own determination, their own volition. And you quote George Kelly, who pointed out that I think 1 in 7 fare evasion arrests, the individual had a warrant, and 1 in 21 arrests, they had a weapon on them. Well, that's not even being prosecuted. Cops aren't making those arrests. You have a scarecrow approach where they've taken some MTA police officers and, like stand by the, the turnstile, and maybe that will deter them. I mean, this is nonsensical stuff. So, everybody plays a role. It's just not the police commissioner and the mayor. You have 5 separately elected district attorneys. You have a governor. The mayor and the governor, traditionally don't get along. Certainly, we see that in this situation. So it's not easy. But the mayor sets the tone in the police department, and cops are, it's like the military. They're following orders. They're not doing lots of things that City Hall doesn't want them to do. That's where these restrictions are coming from. That's where I believe, for instance, the anti-crime units were eliminated because of direction from City Hall. Not so much that the police department wanted to do it. Anybody who was in the department for years would understand how effective they have been in fighting violent crime. So that these are political decisions, and the mayor has a tremendous amount of influence on the police department. And it sounds like that should be obvious, but not everybody believes that, but it's true.
Thank you. Ralph, we touched on the role of severe mental illness, and a lot of the violent crime that's happening right now, a lot of the disorder, the reason people aren't riding subways, as you mentioned, Commissioner. Ralph, will you talk a little bit about what that situation looks like and what policies could be changed to make it better for everyone involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key here is that there needs to be a sort of, if there's any aspect of public safety that needs to be reimagined, it's the approach to serious mental illness. And I want to emphasize the word serious because I do think that previous efforts of the city with respect to the issue of mental illness have just been simply too broad. They've been focused on this kind of amorphous definition of mental illness where, a lot of money is going to things like, just lower, less severe instances of depression, etc. And not enough resources are going to the serious mentally ill people who are dealing with mental crises, people who suffer from paranoid schizophrenia, etc. And it's bleeding into the perception that the city's residents have of how safe they are, particularly in public spaces like the city's subways. Just if you just look at Christmas Eve to Valentine's Day, going from 2020 to 2021, there were at least 6 people shoved onto the tracks of New York City subways. All of the perpetrators were quote strangers with mental health issues, according to the NYPD. In 2020, last year, the NYPD reported 26 incidents of people being pushed in front of oncoming trains onto the train tracks. That's more than half of all the incidents reported in New York between 1975 and 1991. Just to give you a sense of the uptick. What we're doing now is simply not working. What you have here is a system in which someone who is in crisis will be directed to a hospital, they'll be stabilized, and then they'll be immediately released. There are no long-term services in place that are calculated to minimize the risk that these people might pose if they're left to their own devices. It is not, in my view, the compassionate approach. It is an approach that just increases the chances that these people will eventually find themselves in a very dangerous situation where they are either committing a serious crime or becoming either the victim of a serious crime or also, getting involved in a serious use of force incident. These are not the kinds of outcomes that anyone wants to see happen. And I think that in the end, what it comes down to is that the systems that we have in place simply are not doing enough to give needy people, the neediest people, the care that they need. And that's going to require more supervision, not less.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. I used to go and talk to the homeless people who were being fed in Madison Square Park and other parks. So I did my own sort of, informal survey. I think, people say it's a housing issue, or some people do. No, unfortunately, most homeless people, vast majority of homeless people, have significant mental problems, and they're victimized. They are victims. They need help. And as you said, your paper, there are virtually no beds in psychiatric institutions for these people. Yes, I know in the 70s they were eliminated and it was all going to be drugs, but it's not working. You see people out there who really need help. more so than just giving them drugs. So you also mentioned mental health courts, probably we call euphemistically something else, but you need to have people adjudicated before they can go into to an institution. So we need that capacity to be able to do that. It virtually doesn't exist now. As you point out, you bring someone who obviously needs help to the emergency room. They may give him or her a drug, and then they're out the door. There's no capacity to treat them any further than that, with some very rare exceptions. So, yeah, the next mayor has to focus. I think certainly needs state help with creating additional beds for seriously ill people, as far as the mental condition is concerned. I think in terms of the subway, I think we need the police to be on the platforms, because you want to get people to feel comfortable or more comfortable riding the subway than they are right now. So the police officers shouldn't be upstairs looking at their phone, or they should be, to a large extent, during this period of time on the platforms to give some reassurance to the riding public. That's one of the main reasons why people, why there's very few people in Midtown Manhattan. People are afraid to ride that subway.
I couldn't agree more. And I just wanted to add one thing, which is that, when we talk about the sort of disposition of our city leaders, the city council in particular, with respect to, their desire to shrink the footprint of the NYPD, I mean, I would note that better and more supervision would actually go a long way toward that. I mean, on average, the NYPD fields 175,000 calls for what are called emotionally disturbed persons. 175,000 calls per year. And I saw we got a question from the audience about, what's the thought about diverting some of these resources to social services. There are not enough social workers in New York City, nor will there be in the foreseeable future, to field 175,000 calls a year, many of which are coming in off hours, right? 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 4 a.m. It is a real problem, and it's one that is falling in the lap of police departments, around the country, but especially here in New York. And it's not going to change until there is a recommitment and a reassessment of the city's approach wholesale.
Yeah, I know you talked about this, I think, before we went live here, but the Emergency Service Division of the NYPD is particularly well trained for dealing with emotionally disturbed people. They do it every day. Out of the 175,000 universe that you mentioned, about 125,000 are handled, or the emergency service unit responds in addition to other police officers. And their emergency their EMTs, their emergency psychological technicians, they get a lot of training, and they do a very effective job. But for years, this goes back, best of my recollection, to the 80s, there's always been this effort to either replace them or augment them with professional psychological help. And it never seems to work out. Just as you mentioned, the jobs come in at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, they're not working, or the union won't let them work. Police officers are generalists. You can have them do lots of things, and they have really stood the test of time in my judgment. I was in the emergency service unit in the 80s, and I was always impressed with what they do in terms of handling emotionally disturbed people. And as far as I know, they're still doing a very effective job in that area.
No, I think that's exactly right. And one thing that is interesting about that observation is that, part of this sort of critical eye that's been directed at police departments has also been directed at the sort of ESU-like elements of police departments around the country. There is this push to demilitarize police, to have, SWAT teams and ESU teams respond less often, be deployed less often. which seems to me like, counter to what some of the anecdata seem to tell us. I mean, one thing is for sure which is that in 2018 and 19, a 2-year period, ESU officers in the city of New York only recorded one shooting. That's actually pretty good if you ask me, especially when you consider the fact that non-ESU officers recorded 57 shootings over that 2-year period. So if you have a type of unit that seems to be handling these things without the kind of bad outcomes that I don't think anyone wants, I think it's precisely the wrong approach to de-emphasize ESU's role, at least until we can identify a viable alternative.
I see several questions coming in about quality of life issues. And I'll take this time to also remind people that they are free to send in questions through their chat boxes. What do you think the appetite will be under the next administration for renewed focus on police responding to quality of life issues, on community policing, on broken windows policing, and what will be the impact of some of the decriminalizations? Someone asked in particular about marijuana. Commissioner.
For me?
Yes, please.
I think it's an unknown. I think it depends on how bad the situation gets. I think it depends on who is elected mayor. In Rafael's paper, he talked about using community policing to address quality of life concerns. Now, sort of my mentor was Ben Ward, and he was really, in many ways, the father of community policing. And in the 80s, he wanted community policing to be problem-solving policing. And we sort of set up a model for that, where you would have a sort of a precinct team, and you'd have people from the community, perhaps the head of the community council, and other people from the community meet with a team from the precinct on at least a monthly basis. You would lay out these problems because you're getting, number one, you're getting community buy-in as to what the problems are. Lay out those problems, have sort of resources, some dedicated resources if possible to address those problems, and then meet. You then have metrics that you can look at to see if things are being addressed. That's fallen by the wayside. But I think that structure could, if you get the community saying, these are the problems we have loiterers, we have drugs being used in a particular location, or even I've heard there's too much gunfire on the corner, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But you have a structure to address that. But what the appetite is, I think that is an unknown. It seems to me that there's a way disproportionate appetite to restrict the police. There's not that much concern, as much concern as there should be, I think, about the conditions in the city as far as crime, because a lot of the violence is localized. And let's face it, it's in communities of color for the most part. So the impact of what's going on has, I think, yet to spread throughout the city. And I see no reason why it's going to slow down. We'll see. We'll see if the mayor and the administration wants to take these problems on. Every community meeting that you go to in policing, mm-hmm. people talk about the quality of life concerns. That's what they raise, because it's impacting on their life, and they want government to respond to it. So you'll hear that all the time. Whether or not it's going to resonate with the next administration, it's not resonating with this administration, but we'll see what's happening, after January 1st.
Piggybacking. Oh, Ralph, go ahead, and then I'll.
Oh, no, I was just going to quickly say that, I think the commissioner identified a really interesting disconnect, which is the disconnect between what the public seems to want and what the current leadership seems willing to do. And Hannah, you and I identified in a report based on the Manhattan Institute survey that I think it was 68% of New Yorkers either somewhat or strongly supported a community policing approach that actually emphasized quality of life issues. So the public mandate is there, but I do think Commissioner Kelly is right to say that it remains to be seen as to whether or not the leadership is in the city is going to be willing to act on that.
I mean, the fact that no mayoral candidate on the Democratic Party has come forward with any sort of plan to address the burgeoning crime situation tells me that they have done some sophisticated analysis of who they think is going to be voting in the primary and what their issues are. If their issues were crime, they'd be coming out with some sort of program. That's not what the analysis tells them. They're not just doing this willy-nilly. There's a lot of money, there's matching funds, and there's all sorts of consultants that are out there. So they have identified, in my judgment, they have identified restrictions on police as being more important than addressing the crime and quality of life issues right now. Now, maybe after the primary, then they'll try to run to the center. Who knows? We'll see.
Well, a related question about community trust and relationships. There's a very prevalent, very politically powerful narrative nationwide that the police are racist, that policing is somehow inherently racist. When, as mayor, as police commissioner, you weathered a lot of different politically sensitive events, police shootings, riots, and you made it a priority to improve trust between minority communities and the police. Can you talk about any similarities you see and how you were able to bring people together in such an organic and effective way?
Well, I think communication is so important, and visibility. I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but I would go out and walk along streets in Harlem and 125th Street in particular. I'd have one security person with me, and I would listen to people. They'd come up and tell me different things. So you're getting sort of unvarnished feedback of what's going on, and people are aware of that. To the best of my knowledge, this mayor doesn't do anything close to that. So I like to mingle with people in those situations, and I was proud of the fact that after 11 years, or 11 and a half years, I had a 75% approval rating, and which is not easy to do after all that time, and it's 63% approval rating with African Americans. So I worked at it. Pretty much every day, and the department has to work at it every day, and the precinct commanders have to work at it every day. That's something that has to be, on their to-do list every day. You got to meet with community groups. You got to go in on the weekends. You have to, there's a lot of hard work in policing. Some people don't do it, and quite frankly, some people don't have to do it. You can still get your paycheck, but working with the community, having them see you out there, is demanding. Takes a lot of time, and I appreciate you saying that, but I put a lot of effort into it.
Another question, looking back at incidents during your time, both of your tenures as commissioner happened in the shadow of terrorist attacks. First, 1993 World Trade Center bombing, right in the middle of your time under Mayor Dinkins, and then you began your second tour right after 9/11, which very much dictated a lot of the policing priorities that you had, and also probably propelled Bloomberg's mayoral win over Mark Green at the time. It was such a big issue. How important is a sense of real crisis for people to get behind stronger security measures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's very important. A lot of people have said this. It's not just Rahm Emanuel. A lot of people said, don't let a crisis go to waste. And in a sense, that's what we did after 9/11. We put in a lot of programs. We brought in people from the CIA, the DEA, FBI, DIA. We brought in, you know, Hannah, you were there in the intelligence division. Something I had seen in Europe, where, you know, police officers with automatic weapons. I never thought that we'd be able to do it in New York, but we did it after 9/11, and we got no pushback. No, people expected another terrorist attack, and I think they attributed a lot of these things that we put in place as an effort to forestall a terrorist attack. And of course, we had no successful terrorist attacks during the Bloomberg years. So yeah, we use the crisis, the feeling of being sort of on the edge, to put some of these programs and efforts in place. And you know, I think myself, I think you're always going to have critics, but I think generally speaking, we did the right things and it kept the city safe.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard people saying that it will take some sort of big, you know, I mean, it's sort of similar to when will all the communities feel the rise in crime, you know, for there to be the real political will for change. Circling back to the trust between minority communities and police, Ralph, will you talk a little bit about legal cynicism and how it plays into police effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, you know, especially since sort of 2014, there has been just a serious uptick around the country in legal cynicism, which is, you know, a kind of term of art. And basically what it means is just a deep-seated sense that the police as an institution are either incompetent or unresponsive or indifferent or hostile to, you know, issues that are important in minority communities. And, you know, it's something that, you know, is documented. We see it. You know, there was a study in the American Sociological Review in 2016, which found, for example, that in the wake of a sort of controversial viral incident of police use of force, there was a significant decline in the number of 911 calls that were coming out of Black communities after that, which is, you know, kind of an illustration of that point. And, you know, what I think has been underestimated is the degree to which someone like the mayor and leadership within a city can contribute to that, can either reinforce that sense within communities or push back on it and help get communities around, you know, to understanding that these are complex issues, but that by and large, the police as an institution have their interests at heart, you know, that they are motivated by the desire to reduce violence that, you know, is disproportionately impacting minority communities. I mean, if you go back as far as 2008, you'll see that at least 95% of all shooting victims in New York City are either Black or Latino. That is an insane disparity, right? And I think police officers take that job because these are the communities that they want to help. But, you know, if you're talking about Mayor de Blasio, for example, when he first came into office, one of the first, you know, big public statements that he made that got a lot of attention was, you know, about him sort of having to talk to his son about how to avoid being the victim of police brutality, giving the impression that this was sort of the default setting of the average NYPD police officer. And of course, that resulted in, you know, huge numbers of the department turning their backs on him, you know, as a sort of symbolic show of disapproval. And, you know, the mayor didn't really do much to rehabilitate that sense. And I think it's in part because there is right now a constituency, a very loud constituency for anti-police rhetoric. The problem is, though, is that it feeds these misperceptions. And, you know, I would just encourage everyone who's listening to also, in addition to our paper, read a recent report published by the Manhattan Institute, written by Eric Kaufman, that goes into some of these misperceptions. But one that we identified in our report, Hannah, was this 2016 Morning Consult poll, which showed that twice as many Black respondents reported worrying more about themselves or someone they knew becoming the victims of police brutality than of gun violence in general. And that is completely an opposite to what the data tell us is true, right? I mean, a recent study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences says that the odds of dying at the hands of police for Black men are about 1 in 1,000. Contrast that with the odds of just being killed by gun assault for Americans of all races generally. They're dramatically higher at 1 in 298. And we know, for example, that Black men are about 10 times more likely than their white counterparts to be the victim of a homicide. So it's even higher for Black men in particular. But the belief is sincere that that the reality is actually inverted. And I do think that the mayor sets the tone with respect to how the community views these things. And the mayor has a lot of power. The bully pulpit is called the bully pulpit for a reason. And, I do think it's irresponsible for a city's leader to reinforce misperceptions like that, especially when they're so dangerous, because they disincentivize people from not just trusting police as an institution, but also cooperating with them in ways that we know can help reduce crime.
Thank you. It's something that feels so pressing right now. Relatedly, Commissioner, can you talk about, you have a lot of experience dealing with riots, especially riots with a racial aspect to them. Is something that you wrote about in your book, the impact of good policing on making a riot short and reducing the amount of violence and destruction that happens, and just sort of diffusing whatever that tinderboxes that makes riots just become massive and out of control. It's so on people's mind this week. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think you need training, and we learned our lesson the hard way with the Crown Heights riots. The department responded kind of as it always does, and had just a lot of police officers show up. There were no strategies, no tactics, no formations. And basically in Crown Heights, there's a lot of 14 and 15-year-old kids that they were up against. So we took some, quick action, used the mounted police, and one of the things that I was the first deputy commissioner then. I wrote a critique about it, and I also had a manual put together on riot control. And it's been taken in by other departments and used as a manual. Unfortunately, that training stopped in the de Blasio administration. We had riot control training for the entire department, or most of the uniform force, on a rotating basis. The only training that's gone on since de Blasio has come into office is the SRGs, which is the task forces. But they're too small to handle the disorders that we saw last year from May 25th on. So they're still not doing that training, by the way. You require that practice to be able to come together and to stay together and not run out with a nightstick and flailing at somebody. You have to act as a team. As a matter of fact, that was on the on the manual, think team. It's very important, and we did not see that early on as far as disorders in this city are concerned. So I think it has a lot to do, if you look like you know what you're doing, I think it has a lot to do with quelling a disturbance. If you're you have to take the roofs, you need observers, you need people telling you what's going on. There's even an effort in some places not to use helicopters to tell you where the disorder is going, not to follow them. So there's a lot of strange things going on in policing based on what politicians are telling police officers to do. But training in disorder control is a very important aspect in this day and age. And you have to be able to turn out everybody who knows something about disorder control. Because you can't just use the specialized units, because if it goes for several days, you need to replace them. 12-hour tours are very debilitating. You have people who live out in Suffolk County, they work at 12-hour tours, they gotta go home and sleep and come back in. that sort of thing. It's important that virtually everybody knows what to do in a disorder situation.
Well, certainly will still be relevant, I imagine, come June and come November. There's a technology question that came in that I'd like to ask you about, especially given your role, completely modernizing NYPD's technology. But first, especially given our limited time, I'd like to ask, were there any things that stick out to you in your long involvement in law enforcement that you saw mayors do that affected really impressive gains in public safety and community trust with police, not necessarily ones you served under, but that took a certain amount of real leadership skill that you could tell us about?
I think that there's some really impressive law enforcement leaders in a lot of cities throughout the country. You'll see them sometimes when something happens and they're on a press conference, but I think there's a cadre of well-educated, articulate, effective law enforcement leaders. But again, they are limited. They are directed by the elected leadership, and that's the way it's supposed to be. I understand that, but sometimes they can't, shine because they're in the shadow of the political people. But I think let me put it this way: the quality of leadership in policing throughout the country, I think, has gone up significantly, and it's something that hopefully the mayors of cities take advantage of. I did work in a city. I won't say where it is, but they have very competent uniform force. But the mayor just did not want to have them engage in any activity that, in my judgment, would have reduced the murder rate significantly. But for political reasons, the mayor was more afraid of an untoward incident than the shootings going on in communities of color, and that's not that unusual in the country these days. But I think there is an impressive group of leaders that hopefully they'll be able to shine and do good work, and I think they work very closely with communities. They're a pretty savvy group that's out there now in major cities.
That's very heartening. And are there mayors or actions that mayors have taken that's shown out to you as having a great impact that mayors have done?
Right now, the mayors of big cities, you know that there's a 30% increase in murder throughout the country, and obviously focused in big cities. And most mayors are not that concerned about that increase. They're concerned about some sort of action on the part of the police that will cause a disturbance. Now, that's understandable. That's what they should be doing. But I think they have held back the police from engaging in virtually any of the proactive measures that have helped drive crime down. In America, if you go back almost 3 decades, proactivity on the part of the police has worked in reducing crime. So, I don't see any mayor that I'm aware of jumping out and making decisions that help increase the safety of their cities. There may be, but I'm not privy to a lot of information, so I don't know.
Well, I hope we see that change. We're already just about at the hour, so Ralph, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, my closing thought is this. There are clearly shortcomings within the institution of policing, right? Every institution that is constituted by humans is going to make mistakes. There will be imperfections. There will even be instances of malice, right? There are evil people that find their way into all kinds of institutions. focusing on minimizing those bad outcomes is a legitimate end for government to pursue, but they cannot do it in a way that causes them to lose sight of their very first and most important mission, which is to secure the streets of their city so that the rest of the residents can thrive, so that businesses are incentivized to invest in communities, so that people feel safe going out of their homes, so that pro-social forces within the communities don't feel like they have to leave and go to nearby suburbs or leave states entirely. I mean, we are putting New York City in a position in which it stands to suffer for a very long time. And one of the keys to making sure that doesn't happen is to get crime under control. And that's going to mean recommitting to a role for policing and the traditional aspects of our criminal justice system. You cannot do it without that.
Thank you.
Hey, I
Well,
just want to congratulate and thank Manhattan Institute. Thank Rafael. Thank you, Hannah. You're saying things, writing things that should be written and should be said, but certainly, and not everybody is doing it. You're sort of on the cutting edge, and I'm very, very impressed with the things you've done in the Post, in the City Journal, in the Hill. Very, very impressive. So please keep it up. We need you.
wow, what a moving endorsement. And a perfect segue for me to thank the both of you so much for this conversation today, and to invite our audience to please sign up on our website to receive updates from the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, including information on other upcoming events. In particular, join us May 13th for the incomparable Glenn Lowry in conversation with the truth-speaking Barry Weiss, speaking about the nexus between anti-Semitism and anti-racism. And of course, join MI this entire week for the New York City Reborn panels on different policy areas for the next administration to focus on. You can also, on our website, browse the Manhattan Institute's research and subscribe to our newsletters, including our new PPSI newsletter. If you are able, please also consider supporting the Institute at the link that you see on your screen. MI is a not-for-profit organization, and our work, including this work on policing and public safety, depends on support from people like you. Thank you so much, audience at home. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.